everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're here to kind of talk a bit more about expanding your end-to-end test coverage with the new Mabel desktop app. So we appreciate you choosing to spend a part of your day with us. My name's Leah, and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by Andy Horgan. So hey, Andy.
Hi.
Andy and I are both based in Boston, albeit working remotely at the time, but feel free to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And I have a couple of really quick housekeeping items to cover before we get started. So if you're not intimately familiar with Zoom yet, you'll notice the Zoom control panel will appear at the top or the bottom of your window. You're muted by default, but obviously we still love to hear from you. If you have any questions, feel free to throw those in the Q&A section of your control panel at any time. We'll be monitoring those throughout, and we're going to take some questions at the end. If you have any comments or just want to chat, say hello, feel free to use the chat window for that. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to reference it later, share with somebody else on your team, you'll be able to do so. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andy. He's a solutions engineer here at Mabel, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Great. Thanks, Leah. And thank you everyone again just for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about some really exciting new things within Mabel. I'm sure you've gotten some emails or some alerts about some of the new features we've released in Mabel. And I'm going to talk about those today and how they help expand your end-to-end test coverage, really leveraging that desktop application. So just a little bit about me. I'm Andy. I'm a sales engineer here at Mabel. So I work with a lot of different prospects and customers in various different stages of their quality transformation. And I get to see all sorts of different ways that they're leveraging Mabel to really drive value and improve quality across their organization. So I'm going to talk about all the different cool things that we've released over the past couple of weeks, and some of the ways I've seen some existing customers already start to leverage those features to improve their own testing. So just to kind of set the agenda for the day, I won't slide you to death. We're going to do some live demo stuff and really get into the nitty gritty of what's changed, what's new, and all that fun stuff in the desktop app. But before that, we'll kind of set the scene a little bit, give you some context to the desktop application. What does that mean for Mabel and performance improvements and user experience? So I'll give a little bit of a background on that. We'll give a little bit more detail as to what do we mean by easier mobile emulation testing, and how can we leverage that in Mabel for our own testing practices. We'll also go through Mabel's new standalone API testing. What does that look like in practice and orchestrating through plans and some of the different functionality you can expect to be able to leverage with API testing. And then lastly, we'll do a demo where we can dive right into the platform and see what's different, what's new, and some of the cool new things you can do with these new releases. So let's just jump right in and start talking about the desktop application. So what does a move to a desktop application mean? Well, for Mabel, the switch from a Chrome extension to an Electron application is going to translate to a smoother and faster experience for Mabel users. This is really going to be powered by a couple of different factors. One of the main parts that helps drive that is we can have a more performant trainer now that we're no longer pulling the same set of resources from Chrome. The reason being that the trainer is now an Electron app and no longer kind of piggybacking off of the Chrome session. Being on a desktop application also means we've made it much easier to run our tests locally and being able to do so directly within our workspace. So those of you who are familiar with the CLI and have done some local tests through the CLI, you'll be able to achieve the same sort of fast feedback via those local runs without having to log into the CLI or open up a terminal shell. And then finally, with the desktop application, for Mabel users, that means you can probably start to expect quicker releases and more updates much more frequently, given that a lot of the hindrances can sometimes fall upon the approval process for Chrome extensions. Now that we are a desktop Electron app, we'll be able to ship those new features and improvements much more quickly to all you wonderful users. As far as the experience with training with the desktop app, as I said, you'll be able to, see some, major improvements in, training speed, both through replay and actually creation of tests. Um, but you'll also see some added benefits. So for instance, when we create tests within the new trainer, one of the great benefits is the ability for Mabel to completely control the browser state when we initiate a new training session. So gone are the days of old where you have to clear cookies or cache. All of that will be done for you when you launch a new training session, when it's sort of orchestrated through the desktop application. Some other benefits include having the trainer outside of that browser instance and within an electron window means certain trickier parts of your application to train steps on, such as hovering over a sensitive navigation dropdown. Um, can be trained much easier because you're not having that fighting for focus that we used to see sometimes with a hovering window within the actual Chrome extension. And also while we're creating and editing our tests, we've added some new functionality to allow you to kick off local and cloud runs directly within the trainer. So again, to allow you to get that more instant feedback very quickly and help improve your ability to quickly troubleshoot and create tests. Now, talking about mobile emulation, there's definitely a growing demand for being able to expand our test coverage to touch upon a number of different devices. And so Mabel made some really great improvements to try and address that growing need, and really excited to kind of walk you through what that looks like today. So with the new mobile emulation in Mabel, new and existing tests can be easily changed to run on mobile devices. It's really as simple as changing the default device settings for any particular test or plan, and then choosing any number of devices we have currently pre-configured as the default device for that test or plan. Additionally, what we've done with cross-browser testing, we've also been able to introduce for devices as well. So now you can take an existing plan, and what was once a cross-browser plan or test can now become a cross-device plan. So you could have a single plan that's running all of their tests across multiple devices at once. What's even cooler is we can start to implement some conditional logic along with some JavaScript code to detect the user agent being supplied to the test, and be able to have a test that can work on both mobile and desktop. So using that conditional logic, if you see the user agent is mobile, do X. If you see the user agent is desktop, do Y. And we'll kind of talk about that in greater detail during the demo. And this just gives you a nice screenshot of what does it look like to be able to quickly change those device settings. It's really as simple as one of those radio buttons and then selecting a device from that dropdown. Here's something I'm really excited to talk to you all about is our API testing, and what that's going to mean for your own quality efforts across organizations. So with API testing in Mabel, you can now set up standalone API tests that run headlessly, and they run lightning fast. These can be integrated in your CI/CD pipeline. They can be configured in your existing plans. So that it's going to help make for much quicker and efficient end-to-end user flows by being able to leverage those headless API tests, which, compared to say a UI test, which may take a couple of minutes to execute, a standalone API test can execute in a matter of seconds. And so that means, tasks like setting up or creating test data within your application, or API validation, or even deletion of dummy data via API can all be managed just through these headless API tests, so that that portion of your end-to-end workflow is executed in seconds. With the API testing, you'll also see some really cool new capabilities as well. Similar to what we've done with the Mabel trainer and the UI, we've made it best in class at making easy, fast UI tests. The new API interface to create API tests in Mabel is best in class at really being able to create those API tests without having to no Postman style scripting, but still being able to support things like GraphQL bodies, various different headers and methods for our API calls. We've taken away all the complexity of building assertions and creating variables through that Mabel interface. But if you needed to unlock more advanced functionality, maybe beyond assertion or variables, you can do that as well by actually including Postman scripting as well. So, Mabel really is trying to stay true to the low code mantra. If you want to build an API test without knowing any scripting, you certainly can. If you want to get a little bit more nitty gritty and, do some of that Postman scripting as part of your API test, you can do that as well. Do things like make an assertion that your API response time should be no greater than 200 milliseconds. And then on top of that, with our API testing interface, you'll be able to import and export Postman collections in a true one-to-one exchange. So that means you're gonna have a lot of flexibility in how you might leverage some existing Postman collections to be run in Mabel and also integrated within your CI/CD pipeline. And so just to kind of give you a couple of screenshots of that API testing, we can see in here, we have a particular plan, which I'll go into more detail about. But some key things to call out here. Again, we can mix and match our API tests and our UI tests so that we can do certain repeatable actions very quickly, given that an API test, such as the one in the second stage, can run in less than a second. And then our best in class UI interface to make API testing easy really simplifies the process of doing everything from passing authorization to creating assertions and variables within our application. With that said, I think now is a good time to just jump right into the platform and take a look at those three components: the desktop application, local runs, mobile emulation testing, and then finally really take a good look at API testing in Mabel. So hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. When you log into the desktop application, which is what we're looking at here, you'll see a very familiar dashboard. The dashboard everyone knows and loves has stayed the same, so you'll get all that rich reporting right at your fingertips. But then when we dive into actually creating tests and orchestrating those tests, that's when we'll start to see some of those new improvements. So let's go ahead and jump into our various tests in this workspace. And today, let's take a look at this navigation smoke test. So as I mentioned before, we have the ability to configure tests for both desktop and mobile using that user agent string and conditional logic. And I'll explain a little bit of that in just a moment. But when we think about the improvement to the desktop application, what's it like to work on or build a test in Mabel now? So we go ahead and launch the trainer. We'll choose our marketing site. A pretty familiar sort of experience of, all right, a new browser instance is spinning up, and soon after a Mabel trainer appears. And so this should feel very similar to what you're used to within the web interface, with a couple of key differences. The trainers now exist outside of the Chrome browser. So again, some of the key benefits they are, you're not going to worry about the trainer pulling focus from a step you're trying to train in your application. Given that the trainer is outside of Chrome as well, that's how we're going to be able to power a lot of those new performance enhancements. Whereas I know many people are familiar with Chrome being a little bit power hungry, and having the ability to have this trainer exist outside of the Chrome application and within Mabel itself means we can dedicate more computing resources to run things like creating our steps and replaying them in general. I'm going to go ahead and just start to replay this test. And you'll see as this is executing, we're evaluating that JavaScript snippet, which essentially identifies this training session as a desktop instance. And so you'll notice that we skipped all of these steps that are specific to a mobile application. I think this helps give a good sense of those performance improvements I mentioned earlier. We can see we're able to kind of replay through these steps with a little bit more efficiency and speed than maybe we're used to in the web interface. Some other key things to call out about the training experience now. We do have these two new buttons. One will save the test to run in the cloud, the other to run locally. And so you can think of this as a useful way in the sense that if I, as a tester, am working on a new branch of my test or a new particular, I need to iterate and add a couple more steps to it. Rather than ever having to leave my training session, I could simply click this button, start to run that locally. But we also have a couple other means to start running tests locally as well. I'm gonna go ahead and close this training session just so that we can take a better look at what do those local tests look like in Mabel now. If you use the CLI, you're probably familiar with Mabel auth login, and then Mabel test run some sort of ID. You have to know your parameters. We've tried to simplify that as much as possible so that everyone across your organization can start to run their tests locally as early and often as possible. So moving from this particular test, I can click this Run Test tab, and we'll see this new pane appears. One moment. And so some of the key differences here within the desktop application, we now have this new section for local run. We still have the ability to run on the cloud with the added benefit of also being able to choose mobile devices as well for those ad hoc runs, that is. But let's focus on the local runs. So when we're running locally from the Mabel desktop application, we'll keep the current browser, but we also have the option to choose to run this both in headless and a head full manner. So that means you'll either have a web browser kind of walking through the steps as the test executes, or in this case, we'll run headlessly so you can see what that output sort of looks like. Additionally, we can choose what application we're testing against, what environment. But here's another sort of interesting way we can start to leverage these local runs. If I, as a developer, am getting ready to ship out some new piece of feature code, maybe I've went into Mabel and have created a branch called feature edits. I could then run that test against my local build using this URL override. So something like localhost 8000, I can now start to execute those Mabel tests against my local build of that application. In this instance, though, we're just going to run it against the production of this marketing site. Let's start this one run, and we'll see that Mabel starts to initialize the test run. And just like that, we're going to be brought to this terminal window, and all of that test output starts to get logged within that test output. Now, a couple of key callouts here is you'll notice that this test passes in just over 5 seconds. When we talk about being able to test at every stage of the software development lifecycle, the means of being able to help enable that is this faster feedback by being able to deliver lightning quick test results via those local test runs. You can see this being used for either maybe I'm working on a test and I want to validate the changes I'm making don't break the test, or maybe I'm a developer and in a similar fashion, I'm running my test locally against that local build, and I'm just making sure that before I even create that pull request, we're running some sort of sanity check to make sure that there's not a glaring sort of issue with the application. And by being able to identify those bugs earlier, you'll be able to help reduce your technical debt and be able to iterate that much quicker in your release cycles. Now, kind of switching gears a little bit, as we talk about training in running tests from the perspective of mobile emulation. As I mentioned before, the means to edit or create an existing test to be a mobile test is very, very simple. For this particular test example, I could simply click this pencil icon, and where we have the current default set to desktop, which would indicate that when we launch the trainer, it would run in a desktop mode. I can also very easily change that to mobile. I can choose a device from this list, Just to kind of give you a sense, we do cover a lot of different devices within this listing, but for our sake, I will just do iPhone 6, 7, 8, and then click Save. And so now, if I were to think about, making some changes to that mobile test, all I would have to do is, relaunch that trainer. And I'll choose that marketing site. We'll give that a moment just to launch here. And we can see as we launch that trainer, Mabel is already doing the things you may have done manually before, like setting the viewport, setting the DPI, and passing that custom user agent to our Chrome window to say, hey, application, give me the mobile version of this. And so in a similar way, if we were to play through these steps, this time we would see that our mobile steps will get executed as the user agent string would indicate this is not a desktop session, but rather an iPhone 6, 7, 8. And this is a really simple sort of code snippet that anyone can implement in seconds. All we're doing is creating a variable and assigning that variable the value of navigator user agent. You can see when I run this, we get this output of that user agent string. Couple of things we could kind of focus on here. There's iPhone, but mobile is a good place to kind of look at when setting that conditional logic, because that's going to allow this test to not only work across multiple iPhone devices, but now we can start to set this up to run across multiple mobile devices in general. So say a Samsung Galaxy and an iPhone. And so we set that to our variable user agent. And if I replay these steps, we will see that we evaluate the scripts, we enter our conditional logic, and we start to validate the test from the perspective of a mobile user. Really easy and simple to kind of get that stood up and start building and creating tests from the perspective of a mobile user. But so now we start to think about, all right, I have this great test. It is compatible for desktop and mobile. How can I start to orchestrate this in a way that I'm getting the most use or value out of this testing effort? Well, if I look at the plans I have configured for this test, we can see this lives in two different plans. In our very first one, this visual smoke test plan, it's running within the perspective of a desktop user. So when I go to that test output, we'll see in just a moment, it skips the mobile steps for validating our application. And looking at the screenshot, we start to see that we indeed get a proper rendering of our desktop application for this test. And we can try just one more step here, and maybe that screenshot will load a little bit quicker. Nevertheless, I digress. I think a lot of us have dealt with a fair amount of internet issues in this day and age of everyone remote. So I won't belabor the point too long, but of course we get our beautiful desktop application. But if I were to, go back to this test, and then let's look at one of the other plans where we're kind of using this test in a more mobile device perspective. So looking at my plan mobile responsive tests, if I go to these settings here, we can see all of our typical plan settings you'd expect, with the added addition of being able to toggle between desktop and mobile. For this plan, I just have set the iPhone 6, 7, 8 and Galaxy S5. But if I wanted to, I could quickly, add an iPhone 11. Really just as many devices as you can think of, you can start to add those. Or better yet, use that real user monitoring data about your application to kind of pick up on patterns of what's the usage actually like for your application, and then being able to test across those devices within your plans. And so now if I go back to that plan and we look at this output, similar to how we can run our cross-browser tests in parallel, the same applies for a mobile test. And by clicking into either one of these, we can see that we're running a test against Galaxy S5. And when we kind of show that screenshot, we're getting that mobile emulated version. And then if we go back, now we can look at the results for our test that was run across an iPhone 6, 7, 8. So a lot of flexibility in being able to run these multiple device tests in parallel, run it across a desktop and device setting, and really be able to kind of expand your test coverage in that way. But now finally, let's kind of dig into API testing in Mabel. What does it look like in practice? How do we manage and edit our API tests, and what's possible? So I'll go to this plan I have, which is an end-to-end sort of API example. And so similar to how you might expect other tests to run, we have it in stages. If I go to a recent test plan output, we can start to break that down a little bit further. So in this plan, we have 2 UI tests and 2 API tests. And our very first UI test in this plan is a UI test where we generate an API access token. We have to authenticate into the application using our standard credentials. We're then we get generated an access token, which we can then pass forward to our API calls so that we can make authenticated API posts and lists and get and all that good stuff. But so the key things I always like to kind of call out here is you'll notice, our UI tests, they take about 2 minutes to run, whereas all of these, API tests, they're really only taking about a second. And so if we're not necessarily looking to test, can we, create a client in our UI? We just want to be able to validate that everything is presented correctly. Well, maybe that's a good candidate for where we could, implement an API test to stand up that data, be able to run it, exponentially quicker, and then spend our time in the UI just validating, that front end of the application that we're particularly, worried about. Now, to actually build these API tests, let's go ahead and look at this particular one where we create and list a client. Now go ahead and edit these steps. And so you'll see we have this, really slick, easy to use interface. Just kind of walk our way around it. We can see the various methods we can use, any sort of name we want to give this particular API call, our API endpoint. We can pass any sort of authorizations we might expect, like bearer tokens or basic auth. In this instance, we're actually passing forward that token we generated in that UI test in order to authenticate these calls. And then we can add any sort of parameters and headers. Body is a great way that we've made some improvements in not only being able to send a raw JSON body, but we can also support GraphQL as well now. If you need to make any sort of pre-request scripts that execute before your API call, you have the means to do so using that Postman scripting as well. So one of the ways you might think about this is, perhaps you didn't need to, go through the rigmarole of logging into the front end of your application to get that token, but rather you could achieve similar functionality through pre-request. You could insert that within your API test here, and then have all your API tests not only be authenticated, but also inherit its authentication from the previous post. Looking at the rest of this part of the interface, we can see all the various different variables that we've either explicitly declared or we've inherited from a previously run test. So things like the API email, client ID, various different variables that we inherit or create within this test. Now, to actually start to create these tests or variables within an API test is very simple. You can see we have the option to make assertions or use that Postman style scripting if we wanted to, say check the response time is no greater than 200 milliseconds. But in this case, let's make a simple assertion and create a variable. For this example, let's say we want to check the account balance. To do so, we want to parse through the JSON body, and we're going to navigate to the path of main.account.balance. And maybe our assertion is we just want to make sure it's not nothing, it's not null. So we could say the assertion type is not equals to 0, and that's our assertion. And now maybe we want to validate on the front end that whatever we saw for the account balance here is the same in the UI. We could then assign that account balance to a variable and then pass that data forward to a UI test. So incredibly simple to create these assertions and variables within Mabel's API testing. And the ability to mix and match these is really where I think people will see a lot of benefit in being able to increase the efficiency of their end-to-end workflows. Now, that's not to say, if you're so inclined, you could have a plan that's exclusively API calls running very, very quickly. And maybe it's running every 15 minutes as a health check for your APIs. Or, maybe we're just, every time we're creating a pull request, we're testing every API endpoint that we have across multiple versions, you name it. So a lot of flexibility in, expanding our end-to-end coverage and increasing the efficiency of our end-to-end flows as well. So looking at the time we have left here, we just have a couple of, looks about 12 minutes left. So just to kind of bring us back to the slides here to wrap things up and leave some time for questions. Just to talk about some key takeaways, we've made working in Mabel even easier now thanks to the desktop app. You'll be able to replay your tests more quickly, edit and work on your tests more efficiently because that trainer is more performant. And you'll be able to get faster feedback by being able to leverage those local runs. Mobile testing is easier than ever with the new ability to configure new and existing tests to be both cross-browser and cross-device tests. We've really tried to help address that need to expand your test coverage into multiple devices in your quality organizations. And then finally, API testing makes creation, validation, and deletion of test data in your application lightning quick. And being able to leverage these API tests with our UI tests means we're going to be able to achieve better test coverage and much more efficient end-to-end workflows within Mabel. Thank you everyone so much. And I did want to just direct you all, if you haven't already, you can download it at mabl.com/desktop app. And also just speaking more broadly, here at Mabel, we want everyone to succeed and we want to be as supportive and collaborative as possible. So that means whether you want to look at our self-paced trainings and maybe pick up on a trick or two, dive deep into our documentation and really get the full understanding of what all these new features are, or maybe revisit some ones that you haven't used just yet. And then also our friends of Mabel Slack, very active community. We'd love to be able to hear from our users. What do you like? What do you not like? Feedback is key, and we'd love to hear it. So definitely feel free to get engaged with us there. And that's all I have for you all. I hope I was able to cover everything that we wanted to kind of learn about with these new releases. With the time we have remaining, maybe we can touch upon any questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So got a couple of questions both in the chat and the Q&A panel. If you do have any, as we're kind of talking through in the last kind of 10 minutes we have here, feel free to submit those to the Q&A panel. But I've gotten a number of questions here, so I'll just answer this really quickly. Will this be on demand after the live stream? Yes, everyone will get a link to the recording, which will live on mabl.com about 24 hours after this webinar concludes. So you'll be able to share that with members of your team. You'll be able to access it at any time. So that recording will be available for everybody and you will be able to share it. First question here for you, Andy, is when you were talking through API testing in your demo, can we capture network calls and payload on the fly instead of having to know exactly where they are?
That is a very excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't have a concrete answer for that. But what we can do is I'll take a note of the user and maybe follow up just to confirm, we want to capture the network calls on the fly from our API testing.
Perfect. We'll follow up with you after this webinar. From Tom, great demo. What is the estimated or the ETA of when the desktop app will be out of beta?
So I believe, I don't want to misspeak here. Is it in the next month or two? Within the next, I think Q2 is when we're looking to make that GA. Is that correct, Leah?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think it's also dependent on, you know, everyone's feedback during beta and how things go too. So I think Q2 is a good expectation, but you'll definitely see more communications as we get closer to that, when we expect to be able to go into GA for the desktop application. Let me see what other questions. You're welcome, Tom. We've got here. Feel free to drop those in, and I'm just checking the chat. Can you talk a little bit more about the Postman integration? Just kind of give the 1,000-foot view of
Yeah.
for Mabel users.
No, absolutely. So, you know, Postman and is built on the Newman runner, and we leverage a little bit of that magic ourselves. And through that, we're able to really get that one-to-one exchange of Postman to Mabel API tests. And so, from the context of Mabel, and actually, if I just toggle back over to here, I'll show it in just a moment. If I bring up this test, we can see we have the option to export as a Postman collection or import a Postman collection to override steps. And so from that perspective, it's really just as simple as exporting within Postman that collection. I believe the recommended is v2 point some number. That collection can then be imported as that JSON collection. And then typically the only other places we see a little bit of work is sometimes variables need to be redefined based on scope, whether it's an environment or collection variable. But as you can see, it's very easy to kind of manage our variables in the context of API testing within Mabel. So that should be a pretty an easy lift to kind of reconfigure any sort of environment specific variables for Postman collections. I hope that's helpful. Always happy to follow up with folks later too.
Thanks, Andy. Next question here is, can we trace back steps of executions to improve debugging?
So when we think about tracing back steps, oh, I see, as in the trainer. So unfortunately right now, this is very good feedback, for, maybe down the road, but you can't necessarily step back steps in the trainer. The best I think you could do is you can always pause the recording, manually get your application back to that previous step, and then, start to retrain from there.
All right, thanks. Is it possible to test in time zones?
So this comes up a fair amount, and it's a little tricky because of the way you run your Mabel tests. They're always from, the US server locations. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have a way of necessarily spoofing a location. If you're able to sort of configure a custom header for your application that would be acceptable to sort of invoke that time change, you might be able to do so through that way. However, we can't necessarily actually, like a VPN could spoof your location to, say a different time zone. So for now, unless there's a way to do it with custom headers, that's really the only avenue I can think of to kind of deal with that.
Awesome, thanks, Andy. Can we use API testing as an overall API health monitoring tool? And is there a dashboard just for your API tests?
That is an interesting question. So I think one of the ways you can think about, there's kind of two parts to that question. Yes, I think you could use it to, monitor the overall health of your APIs. Given that you're able to execute them very quickly in any sort of set schedule, say every 15 minutes. When it comes to actually being able to look at dashboarding specific to your API tests, I think that's where you could maybe get a little clever with how you configure your workspace. Maybe you have your API tests all live within a certain application, so that you could leverage the application filter in order to help sort out some of the different results from your workspace, so that you're only looking at those API test results versus those UI test results. And then you could also do things like leverage labels, of course, as well, to act as another filtering mechanism. So I'd say yes and yes.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. Next question here is, mobile companies are releasing new cell phones every month. Do we plan on kind of keeping up with, new kind of device types in our mobile web emulation?
So and I don't want to speak for engineering, but I would think you can probably expect some degree of, kind of keeping up with, added additional support for devices as they're released. We'll keep the ones we currently have and, kind of iterate from there. So I'll say that's, sort of a tentative yes.
And again, if there's, models that you need to be testing on a regular basis that's not supported, absolutely give our team that feedback as well. All right, we're coming up on time, so maybe I've got a couple more questions here. If we don't happen to get to yours, feel free to continue asking. We'll just make sure we follow up with you after the webinar. This one here is, can we insert mocks in the trainer? I assume that's...
Yeah, so network mocking, that's not something we can do yet. I'm not sure on the time frame. I know there's interest in sort of being able to create that. So I would just stay attentive to any sort of news outlets from Mabel. But today we can't do that network mocking just yet. But that is something that we are looking to improve upon.
Yeah, again, if that's something obviously super important to you, feel free to submit product feedback as well, and that's something that gets considered as a part of our roadmap. So thank you for that question. It looks like we probably have one more, and then we'll have to close out. But for the API testing calls, can we decide if it's a curl, REST, etc.?
So right now, it's just a REST API call right now. I don't believe you can do any sort of a curl directly within that API testing suite. Yeah, I'm quite sorry, but plenty of documentation should be available to kind of make that abundantly clear, much more clear than I was perhaps. So I definitely encourage everyone to take a look at that documentation to really get a full sense of what's possible with the API testing.
Yeah, and I'll add a link in the chat for anyone who's interested. Just this is kind of the general place to access API testing documentation, but there's quite a few kind of sub documents in there if you have questions. That is all of the time we have scheduled for the day. I see a couple more questions in the queue here, so we'll definitely make sure we take a look at these. We'll get them answered via email in the next day or so. And thank you so much. We really appreciate you all choosing to spend part of your day with us. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Andy. His email's here. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay well.
Thanks all.